Good day. Today is Monday, 9th June 2025, and I'm now properly established back in my home in London, doing videos from here, and will be continuing to do them for the next few months. And I think, as I discussed in recent programs, the correct thing to do in starting this program is to say a few things about the situation in Georgia, though I intend, as is my practice, to return to my various discussions of Georgia in future programs, touching on continuing developments there. First thing to say about Georgia is that I had an extraordinarily generous and hospitable welcome from my hosts, for which I am extremely grateful. Stories about Georgian hospitality probably understate the truth. The quality of Georgian food and wine is also perhaps underestimated around the world. They've always had a legendary quality. The legends do not match, do not equal the reality, which far surpasses them. I was astonished also by the cultural wealth of the country, its beautiful churches, the beauty of the city, the capital city, Tbilisi itself, the antiquity of some of the churches. I visited one which dated to the 6th century, another much bigger church from the 11th century. As I said, one cannot but be awed by the culture of the country. I should also add that I was hosted at a reception at the Opera House in Tbilisi. I watched a performance of a Georgian opera, Daisi, written in the early 20th century by Georgia's national composer. I was amazed at finding myself in an opera house, in most respects the equal, in fact all respects the equal, except perhaps size, to many opera houses in Europe, built of marble in an extraordinary Moorish style, a remarkable architectural achievement in itself, I should say, but also to a performance of an opera that, in my opinion, was fully up to the best international standards, something I would not have expected to find in a country such as Georgia, as small as Georgia is, a sign of how deeply culture and cultural traditions are taken there, and how deep and strong the educational and cultural level is in Georgia, and the professional levels of performance. So much to see and do in Georgia, and it's a country that has not been discovered as yet by mass tourism. So if you want to go to a place and see a beautiful, verdant countryside, very different from that of Greece, by the way, just to say, a beautiful, verdant countryside to enjoy amazing food and wine, and to see amazing things and to appreciate the local culture, I can think of no better place. But of course, it is the politics of Georgia that are interesting. And here I'm going to say straight away that Georgia has clearly been through some very rough times in its recent history. You see the evidence of that in many things. Some of the buildings, for example, in Tbilisi still bear some of the indications of a long period of neglect. But it's also fair to say that the country has clearly turned the corner. There is an extraordinary economic boom underway. Growth rate, the GDP growth rate is around 10%, which is by any measure extremely high. There are inevitably worries about how sustained the boom is, whether there's elements of bubbles within the boom. There probably are, by the way. But that doesn't negate the fact that economic growth is very rapid, and a very real measure of political stability has also been achieved. Now, I say that, of course, a couple of months ago, if you've been following the media in the West, you might have gained a different impression. There was a foreign agents law, which was passed by the Georgian parliament, which attracted immense criticism in the West. Then there was an election, a parliamentary election. There were lots of claims that the government party would lose the election. There were protests on the streets of Tbilisi, or so we were told, threatening the outcome of the election. The then president, Mrs. Zuraibishvili, was outspokenly hostile to the government and gave everybody the impression that she would not vacate the presidential residence when her term ended. A very strong impression was given of a country in deep political crisis. Well, having gone to Georgia, I have to say that I don't recognize that picture now that I have been there. Overall, the country is stable. I did see a small group of protesters around the Georgian Parliament building. I noticed that they were carrying American and EU and Ukrainian flags. My guesstimate is that there were around 150 to 250 people there altogether. They were certainly outnumbered by bystanders who were passing by, just to say. And it also seemed to me that these protests were very much happening inside a kind of closed bubble or ecosystem. The rest of the country seemed to be going about its business entirely normally. Most people seemed entirely determined to keep as far away from the protests as possible. You could argue that the basic way to see these protests on the part of most of the country is one of wary indifference and neglect. Overwhelmingly, I got a very strong sense that most people in Georgia, aware of the recent instability, in fact, a pattern of instability that goes right back to Georgia's independence from the Soviet Union in 1991, that most people in Georgia are very, very relieved, finally, that their country has achieved this stability and this very rapid economic growth, and they do not want in any way to jeopardize these things by supporting political experiments, which they are not, frankly, attracted to anyway. I would add that the external partners of Georgia through all those periods of crisis after 1991, the United States and the other various Western powers, in my opinion anyway, have misunderstood Georgia profoundly. They have failed to understand that this is in some ways a deeply conservative, intensely Christian country, one which greatly values its traditions and which finds some of the very advanced, liberal, progressive ideas current in the West, which the West has tried to promote in Georgia itself. It has found many of these ideas at best bewildering and at worst distasteful. As you will realize, I am again choosing my words extremely carefully. So this has led to, I think, a fundamental shift, a fundamental change in Georgia's direction. I think in some ways the events of the last few months, the attempts to disrupt an election, the attempts to change the normal political course of the country, the attempts also to push Georgia into a confrontation with Russia. The Georgian Prime Minister, whilst I was there, in fact, in the very room where he spoke about the fact that the Western powers attempted to get Georgia in 2022 to start a military campaign against Russia in order to relieve pressure from Ukraine. Of course, Georgian authorities have spoken about this previously. There have been no very strong or clear contradictions of this claim from the West, from the United States, which makes one strongly suspect that the Georgian Prime Minister is telling the truth. Anyway, there is no wish, as far as I could see, amongst the vast majority of people in Georgia to get drawn into some kind of confrontation, military confrontation with Russia, an immensely larger and far more powerful country than Georgia, in order to fulfill someone else's political games, geopolitical games, and in order to come to the rescue of another country, Ukraine, which of course did nothing to assist Georgia in 2008, when Georgia itself found itself in a military crisis with Russia. So that, I think, was an enormously important catalyzing moment, and the attempt, as I said, to obstruct the law, the foreign agents law, and to interfere in the progress of the Georgian election, that has also had an important catalyzing effect also. And beyond that, something I was not aware of until I went to Georgia, there's apparently been a bill, a massive sanctions bill, targeting various Georgian political leaders, which has been working through Congress. Some people told me that it has actually already been signed into law. I can't say I'm fully informed about it. But anyway, the effect of that bill on a country which, since 1991, has consistently pursued a pro-Western alignment, has been extremely ill-received in Georgia, to put it mildly, and has had, shall we say, another crystallizing effect on the developing attitudes, not just of the Georgian political elite, but of Georgian society. So Georgia is in the midst of a great change. It's now relooking at its region. It's perhaps thinking rather less of playing some kind of great role in the clash of democracies and autocracies that the former US President Joe Biden used to talk about. It's keen to re-establish good relations, or to establish good relations. It already has good relations with most of its neighbours. It also rather warily seeks better relations with Russia, with which, of course, it has had a long, intense, and not always happy history. My impression concerning this is that there is still significant wariness of Russia within some sections of Georgian society. It remains the colossus to the north. There is still the enormous complex issue of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, an open wound, I think, for Georgians, the loss of these two territories. There is still uncertainty as to the way back, and there is, by the way, also, incidentally, intense resentment of suggestions that the current Georgian government is somehow a cat's paw of Moscow's, when Georgia and Russia, for the moment, don't even have diplomatic relations with each other. But anyway, there are these attempts to rethink Georgia's alignments, to rethink its development strategy. One of the interesting facts that you discover when you go to Georgia is that, of course, for many years, going back at least to the Rose Revolution and even beyond, we were getting all kinds of stellar claims about Georgia's economic development and extremely fast economic growth. The reality is that the growth that has taken hold now seems to come from a very low base, which makes me, to put it mildly, skeptical about some of those earlier claims of economic growth which had been made before. Anyway, that's a big topic to discuss more fully some other time with someone who knows the condition of the country better than I do. But anyway, the point I am making is that there is an understanding that the relationship with Russia remains crucial, that the country, Georgia, needs in some way to re-establish a good relationship with Russia. And I'm going to guess that that understanding also exists in Moscow, and that they too, though obviously for rather different reasons, want to establish a good relationship with Georgia also. So it is likely that these two countries, Georgia and Russia, will over time feel their way back towards each other. Certainly, and it is a point that I made whilst I was in Georgia, I don't think Georgia needs to fear Russia in any sense. I don't think Russia has any plan to try to absorb Georgia again. I can't imagine that anybody in Moscow can see any potential benefit to Russia in doing such a thing. But of course, where there is fear, there is uncertainty. Where there is fear, that can lead to hostility. I think the best thing for Georgians to do is to put aside their fear of Russia, and on the Russian side, to put aside their fear that Georgia might one day align itself in a way that is hostile to Russia with the West. So, an extremely interesting visit. It was very, very impressive to see how sophisticated the internal conversation in Georgia is. As I said, this is a highly educated society. You hear lots of people complaining about the state of the education system in Georgia. Probably true, but nonetheless, Georgian society overall remains educated and very sophisticated. And it is very interesting and in some ways very impressive to see how this country, which is not a large country, is gradually finding its way back, developing sensible, realistic policies, building its prosperity, strengthening its independence and sovereignty, and positioning itself intelligently in the changing world system which is to come, which is developing and which is to come. So I will no doubt be saying a lot more about Georgia in future programs, but perhaps those were my major and most striking impressions. As I said, it's certainly a country to visit, and it's very impressive to see how realistically and intelligently and courageously people there are addressing their problems. And claims of instability and all of that, in my opinion, are greatly exaggerated and do not actually reflect the realities that I see there, that I saw there. Anyway, that's what I want to say today about Georgia. I expect I will return to this topic again in the future, perhaps looking more at its foreign policy options, maybe its future economic policies. But let me now return to the two topics that I want to discuss today. The one is, of course, the conflict in Ukraine, and the other are the rather interesting developments in the relationship between China and the United States. Now, yesterday, the Ukrainian intelligence chief, Kirill Budanov, was reported as saying, I think he might actually have said it not yesterday, but the day before, that even though Ukraine really doesn't want to proceed with the agreements that were made in Istanbul on the 2nd of June, the ones about the exchange of prisoners and the receipt of the bodies of dead Ukrainian soldiers, it would eventually be obliged to do so. And he seemed to indicate that the Ukrainian soldiers, the bodies of the dead Ukrainian soldiers, were likely to be accepted by Ukraine over the course of this week. Well, today, after lots of delay and hesitation on the Ukrainian side, the first steps in that direction have been taken. I've seen pictures of Russian prisoners under the age of 25 being returned to Russia, and they're pictures which suggest that finally the prisoner exchange is underway. I'm going to make a guess that there's been intense domestic and external pressure on Ukraine to proceed with the Istanbul agreements, though Zelensky himself and his officials have made no attempt to conceal their deep resentment at the way in which they've been forced into doing this thing. So that's the first thing I wanted to say about the way in which Ukraine is now at last complying with these agreements, as I said, that were reached in Istanbul. In my opinion, the damage here has been done. Ukraine has come across very badly, at least the Ukrainian government has come across very badly in its response to the agreements in Istanbul, which were, to be clear, humanitarian in nature. We're not talking about requirements for Ukraine to agree to ceasefires or to withdraw from territories or do any of that kind. It's just an exchange of prisoners and an acceptance of the corpses of dead Ukrainian soldiers. But anyway, we are where we are, and no doubt under domestic and foreign pressure, the Ukrainians finally are coming round to doing these things. In all other respects, we are at a complete standstill. Now, last night, the Russians conducted another big drone and missile strike across Ukraine. And the reports in Russia, by the way, are now making it very clear that amongst the targets of the two last missile strikes, as well as military targets, airfields, for example, industrial facilities servicing the Ukrainian armed forces, but also energy facilities are being attacked as well. Now, so far there's been no reports of power cuts or power interruptions, but we are in summer and there's probably less need for the Russians to hold back from such attacks. Of course, a couple of days ago, the Ukrainians carried out an attack on the energy system in Kherson and Zaporozhye, which did plunge these regions for a time into darkness. The Russians have long since made clear that the 30-day energy truce that Donald Trump brokered, that has completely broken down. We see that the Ukrainians, for their part, are not hesitating to attack, at any rate, parts of the energy system that are under Russian control. They, of course, argue that the energy system in Kherson and Zaporozhye is not Russian at all, but actually Ukrainian. But anyway, but it looks as if the Russians themselves have started to attack energy facilities in Ukraine also. Well, these attacks by the Russians, which are enormous in scale, apparently something like, just under 500 Geran drones launched into the skies over Ukraine last night. Anyway, and large numbers of missiles as well. Anyway, these attacks, which are enormous in scale, well, I was going to say that they are devastating in their effect. But not if you believe the Ukrainians, because according to the Ukrainians, of the 470 so Geran drones that were operating in the Ukrainian skies, only 2 got through to reach their targets, and only one missile, as far as I could see, hit its target also. According to the Ukrainians, everything else, all of the other missiles, all of the other drones, including 10 hypersonic Kinzhal missiles, were all shot down. Now, I said in a recent program that Ukrainian claims about the success of their air defense system are becoming increasingly fantastic. I have never believed them. I have always believed, right from the time when the Russians first began missile strikes on Ukraine in October 2022, that the Ukrainians were overstating their success in shooting down Russian missiles. But, well, we've now moved from the implausible to the frankly surreal. The idea that only 2 Geran drones and 1 missile got through, and that all the hypersonic missiles were shot down, seems to me borderline incredible. I'm going to delete the word borderline. They seem to me incredible. And the Ukrainians, as far as I can tell, are now straightforwardly making it up. Now, why are they doing it? Because we are getting reports of impacts of missiles and drones across Ukraine. Significant damage is being done. President Zelensky of Ukraine never stops complaining about the fact that Ukraine is short of Patriot missiles. He is demanding all the time that the United States supply more. The United States, as I discussed in my program yesterday, is saying that they're not going to supply any more. Ukraine supposedly has up to 8 Patriot missile batteries, but we're told that because of the shortage of Patriot missile interceptors, only around 2 of them are operational at any one time. I would add that pictures have appeared of Patriot missile batteries countering Russian missile attacks in the Kiev area on particular nights over the last week or so. The pictures appear to show huge numbers of Patriot missiles being launched into the skies, about a dozen at a time, as Ukraine tries to shoot down missiles. This level of Patriot missile expenditure must be reducing stockpiles, Ukrainian stockpiles, even further. And one wonders how long this can go on for. But anyway, put all that aside. Why are the Ukrainians talking in this way? Why are they now making this all up to the extent that they are? Well, I'm going to suggest it's the same as with the attack on Totkino in Kursk region. Zelensky still makes speeches and makes comments talking about the Ukrainian army having a presence on Russian territory in Kursk, that the Ukrainians have not really been driven out of Kursk region at all. It's essentially a continuing attempt, or so it seems to me, by the Ukrainians to foster the idea that they're being more successful altogether than they obviously are, and that they're still in the game, that they're still able to keep on fighting and are in the game. Now, I say that, of course, the Russians have a completely different account of what has happened over the last couple of hours. They've given detailed accounts of their strike. They talk about Kh-22 cruise missiles and drones being used. There are apparently lots of claims from the Russians of attacks on infrastructure. We're told about strikes on Pechenegi in Kharkiv region, about Dubno in Rivne region, about fuel storage facilities and distribution units hangars and maintenance facilities, open parking areas for aircraft, temporary air defense and radar tracking points, field command posts for airfield control, all being attacked and destroyed. We're told about aircraft that have also been destroyed, and about potential attacks and destruction, or at least damage to some aircraft, though not, interestingly, F-16s. We're told about attacks on Nikolai Polye in Donetsk region and of the damage that was done there. We're also told, interestingly and rather curiously, that Snakes Island was also attacked, and that there were also attacks in that vicinity altogether. So the Russians are giving a completely different picture about the success of their missile and drone strikes across Ukraine yesterday. And again, I'm going to say it straightforwardly, I go with the Russians. I think in this connection, the evidence tends to confirm what they're saying. The independent evidence tends to confirm what they're saying. And of course, if we're talking about the situation on the battlefields, yesterday the Russians confirmed that the important center of Zarya, a fortified village south of Konstantinovka, has been finally captured by the Russian army. That has significantly diminished the size of the territory south of Konstantinovka that the Russians control. There have been more reports today of further Russian advances in this area, and the Russians are now talking about the continued offensive of a Russian tank division into Dnieper region, and of this division advancing deeper into Dnieper region. The Kremlin spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, Putin's spokesman, has talked about this being intended to create another buffer zone. But in my opinion, all of this is pretty much clearly intended, ultimately, for an advance eventually to the Dnieper itself. Incidentally, I noticed that Group of Forces North has also been talking about Russian advances in Sumy region, and they've recently taken to referring to the regional capital, which is of course Sumy city, in ways that suggest that the objective is to capture it too. Just saying. Now, all of this is going on, and in the meantime, the Russian ambassador to Britain, Mr. Kellin, has been giving interviews to Sky Television here in Britain. Now, I should say straight away that I'm not absolutely clear when this interview was given. I believe it was given several days ago, probably shortly after the attack on the railway train, the passenger train on the railway bridge inside Bryansk region. But as so often happens, Sky Television has not provided us, at least I haven't found it, with a complete transcript of the interview. You're having to piece it together from many different releases. But in the most recent fragment of this interview that has appeared, it turns out that Mr. Kellin said some very interesting things. He said that for the moment, Russia is still conducting a special military operation, which is a relatively limited operation. He said that whether it is upgraded, however, depends on the actions of Ukraine, that Ukraine has been behaving in a way that points to continued escalation, and that if that happens, then Russia will indeed upgrade the special military operation and will start taking stronger action, like, for example, destroying the bridges over the Dnieper River. Now, Russia does unquestionably today possess the capabilities to destroy the Dnieper bridges. The Fab 3000 bombs, precision-guided bombs that the Russian Air Force now routinely uses in Ukraine, can destroy these bridges. So can the Kinzhal hypersonic missiles. So can probably other missiles like the KH-22 and 32 missiles. Back in 2022, when the special military operation began, it is possible that the Russians would have had significant difficulties destroying the Dnieper bridges. They are very strongly built infrastructure. Simply hitting a bridge with a missile is not going to destroy it. But today, 3.5 years after the start of the special military operation, with the Russian military upgraded to the extent that it has been, with mass production lines of hypersonic missiles, and not even counting the Oreshnik, and precision-guided bombs underway, there can be no doubt at all that Russia does indeed possess the capability to destroy the Dnieper bridges. That then brings us to the question of why Ambassador Kellin brought this entire topic up. Now, he is a very senior diplomat. I don't believe that he is simply making things up or talking off the top of his head. I believe that Ambassador Kellin reflects briefings and in fact is authorized to speak about information he's getting from Moscow, and that a serious debate about upgrading the special military operation and taking action like destroying the Dnieper bridges is indeed now underway in Moscow. And that is consistent with what I have been saying in my recent programs, that over the last couple of days or weeks, Ukraine has taken ill-advised steps like blowing up trains inside Russia, rather blowing up bridges with trains, crossing them inside Russia, targeting civilians, targeting Russian air bases and things like that, which have led the Russians to the conclusion that it is not only appropriate for them to start thinking about upgrading the SMO to something else, maybe a counter-terrorist operation, and to start targeting specific Ukrainian officials, as I have been advised by more than one source now, the Russians are actively considering doing, and that there will be no significant political costs for Russia if it does so. That Russian public opinion would support such a step. It tends to get forgotten, by the way, in the West, the extent to which Russian and Ukrainian societies are extremely deeply interconnected with one another. There are people with families on each side of the conflict zone. There was undoubtedly, for a long, long time, strong inhibitions within Russia about conducting a conflict, a military conflict against Ukraine. But of course, Russia has also had to consider the diplomatic implications of taking such an action, the effect that it might have on possible negotiations with Ukraine, possible Western reactions as well. And of course, there's also been, as I said already, the evolving capabilities. I think that the Russians have concluded that over the last couple of weeks, the capabilities now are now fully there. Ukraine's actions have crossed too many red lines, and I'm not talking about Russian red lines. I'm talking about red lines drawn by some people in Washington. I'll come to that in a moment. And that the point has been reached, as Putin said a few weeks ago, when Russia should take steps to end the war sooner rather than later, and that the political space to actually go for stronger measures now exists. Now, one person who has spoken out, for example, in the United States is Senator Tuberville. Not sure exactly who he is, but he now says that there's no doubt about it. Zelensky can't win this war on his own. He knows he's losing. And he apparently said this in a radio interview in the United States. And as I understand it, he represents Alabama. And he also called Zelensky a dictator. And he said that Zelensky has created all sorts of problems for us. We had a lot of money that has disappeared. It is not known where it went. Now, as I said, I don't know who Senator Tuberville is, and he may not be of anybody of any great importance. But I do think that he does represent an evolving view within some people in the United States. And to repeat again what I discussed yesterday, it does look as if the momentum has gone out of Senator Lindsey Graham's bone-crushing sanctions bill. Now, in my program yesterday, I also said that I thought that one of the factors that might have played a role in causing the United States, the White House, Donald Trump, to start taking steps to neuter this sanctions bill was the shock that Americans feel, that the American leadership feels about Ukraine's decision to strike at the air bases, the strategic bomber bases, without first consulting the United States, or at any rate showing complete disregard and indifference to the interests of the United States. Well, I am now going to modify that view to a great extent. I think there is some element of what I said there. I think the Americans are shocked, and I think people in Donald Trump's circle and Donald Trump himself are probably very angry indeed with the Ukrainians for doing what they did by attacking the bases. But I now believe that the single event that turned the White House against the decision against Lindsey Graham's sanctions bill was a telephone call which took place between Donald Trump and the Chinese President Xi Jinping on the 5th of June. Now, Donald Trump has provided his own Truth Social accounts of this call. I've been waiting to see whether the Americans would provide an actual readout, but they didn't. And I'm coming round to the view that the United States government has basically stopped bothering to produce readouts when Donald Trump provides Truth Social posts about his conversations instead. So we must treat Trump's accounts as, if you like, the American readouts. Anyway, immediately after the call, Trump made a Truth Social post. Actually, it was immediately prior to the call, in which he said that I like President Xi of China, always have and always will, but he's very tough and extremely hard to make a deal with. So that was Trump on the 4th of June. Very early in the morning, by the way, at 7:17 a.m. And then Trump published another Truth Social post, much longer, in which he said that I just concluded a very good phone call with President Xi of China, discussing some of the intricacies of our recently made and agreed to trade deal. There is no trade deal between China and the United States that I'm aware of. What there was an interim agreement that China and the United States reduced tariffs from the stellar levels that they had previously achieved to more realistic levels. And this happened over the course of a recent meeting in Geneva. And there were supposed to be follow-up discussions to it. But anyway, if Trump wants to refer to that as a trade deal, I'm not going to object. Anyway, the social post then goes on to say that the call lasted approximately 1.5 hours. So it's a very long call. Calls that Trump conducts with Putin and Xi seem to be extremely long and resulted in a very positive conclusion for both countries. Our respective teams will meet shortly at a location to be determined. That location, by the way, is London, and they're meeting tomorrow, just to say. So they're going to be meeting, and we will be represented by Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, Secretary of Commerce Howard Lutnick, and United States Trade Representative Ambassador Jameson Greer. During the conversation, President Xi graciously invited the First Lady and me to visit China, and I reciprocated. And then Trump said that we both look forward to having these meetings. The conversation was almost entirely focused on trade. Nothing was discussed concerning Russia, Ukraine. Now the last is very interesting because, as we will see, the Chinese readout that doesn't actually refer to Russia, Ukraine, says or puts things rather differently. Now, the Chinese readouts are always very interesting because they're very long and they're usually very detailed, though they don't always cover the full extent of what was discussed. They do often give a rather interesting picture of what was discussed, and it can often be significantly different from what especially the Americans say. Now, the first thing to say about the Chinese readout, which appeared on the 5th of June, is that it does suggest that this was indeed, as Trump says, a friendly conversation. Xi Jinping and Trump do get on well at a personal level. I don't think it's any secret that Xi Jinping couldn't stand Joe Biden, who, of course, went out of his way to insult him on numerous occasions in public, whereas at a personal level, he's always gone on well with Donald Trump. But there is nothing in the Chinese readout, for example, about any kind of agreement reached on rare earths. As I understand it, the Chinese have somewhat relaxed their restrictions on exports of rare earth, but they've certainly not lifted them entirely. And it does talk about a further meeting, a follow-up meeting between delegations to try to consolidate and to build on what was agreed about 2 weeks ago in Geneva. But then it goes on to say this: the Chinese side is sincere and at the same time has its principles. The Chinese always honor and deliver what has been promised. Both sides should make good on the agreement reached in Geneva. China has been seriously and earnestly executing the agreement. The United States should acknowledge the progress already made and remove the negative measures taken against China. And all of this, alongside other comments about the need to resolve all relevant issues through dialogue and consultation. Now, there is no reference here to Russia, and there is no reference here to Ukraine. And there is, of course, no reference either to Senator Lindsey Graham's bone-crushing sanctions. But bear in mind what those bone-crushing sanctions are. They are a threat to impose 500% tariffs on goods from China if China continues to buy Russian energy products. And in fact, Lindsey Graham has been unwise enough to give lengthy interviews, which I have watched, in which he makes it pretty obvious that his bone-crushing sanctions first and foremost target China. Obviously, he will say, only if the Chinese continue to buy Russian gas and uranium and oil. However, the Chinese have long-standing agreements to buy all of those things from Russia, and in fact, they seem to be well advanced now into finishing the deal, signing up the deal for Power of Siberia 2, which is supposed to be entering the construction stage quite soon. And, well, I've read one report which says it should be completed by 2027, which seems to me an impossible deadline, and I might have understood it. But anyway, that's what it said. And the Chinese are also talking about importing gas and oil from Russia through other formats also. So the Chinese seem to be in no mood to stop buying oil, gas, and uranium from Russia. And notice that we are told that the Chinese have their principles. And one of those principles, which they've spoken about many times, is that they will not allow external actors to interfere with the conduct of their foreign trade, and they will not allow external actors to interfere in their relationship with Russia. And we're then told that the Chinese always honor and deliver what has been promised. Well, Donald Trump has suggested that the Chinese have gone back on some of the agreements about rare earths, for example, but Xi Jinping is saying that simply isn't true. And he then goes on to say that both sides should make good on the agreement reached in Geneva. China has been seriously and earnestly executing the agreement. Now, the United States has passed some measures restricting exports of important goods to China. But of course, you could also argue that this looks forward. It also is a kind of warning about further steps by the United States, unrelated to the direct China-US relationship, to place restrictions on exports to the United States of Chinese goods. And we're then told that the United States should not only acknowledge the progress made, but remove the negative measures taken against China. Could one of those negative measures, in effect, be Lindsey Graham's bone-crushing sanctions bill, which is threatening China with 500% tariffs? Well, I cannot myself imagine that these words in the readout say anything else. Just to say. Now, this is a Chinese readout of the conversation, what both the Americans and the Chinese are going out of their way to say is a very friendly conversation between the Chinese and US presidents. But then let's go back to that Truth Social post that Trump published just before that conversation took place. I like presidency of China, always have and always will, but he is, and then this is all, the next part of it is capitalized, very tough and extremely hard to make a deal with. I can't help but think that the Chinese have simply told the Americans in the clearest terms, and that Xi Jinping also told Donald Trump over the course of that telephone conversation, that China is not impressed at all with Lindsey Graham and his plans for bone-crushing sanctions and 500% tariffs on Chinese goods. And I think the Chinese made it quite clear to the Americans that if such a bill were ever brought into law, it would have a completely negative consequence on relations between China and the United States. We would be catapulted back into an economic war, which, as these readouts show, Trump is anxious to get out of, and this time there would be no way back. And I think the administration has taken the message, and that explains why over the last few days, as shown by the Wall Street Journal, the administration has been telling Lindsey Graham to back off, and we're getting all of those reports that American senators and Congress people are now cooling on the whole idea of Lindsey Graham's sanctions. My own view about what Lindsey Graham was trying to do is that he was ultimately trying to keep Trump pursuing a hardline position against both China and Russia. He was basically saying to Trump, look, you've got to take a hard line with the Russians. You've got to go on backing Ukraine. After all, didn't Lindsey Graham go to Kiev and meet with Zelensky and come back and give every indication that he thought that Ukraine was still worth supporting and should continue to be supported? Anyway, Lindsey Graham was basically conveying to Trump the fact that he should continue to provide full US support for Ukraine, and he was also telling Donald Trump that Trump and the administration and the United States should continue to take the hardest possible line on China, including full backing for Taiwan. And if he didn't, if Donald Trump decided to cross that line and start acting in a way that Lindsey Graham and his neocon friends judged was soft towards the Russians and towards the Chinese, well, there are 81 senators now in the Senate sponsoring a bone-crushing sanctions bill, and if Trump starts behaving in that inappropriate way, then there is a majority in the Senate to impeach him. Remember, this is a president who has experienced 2 attempts to impeach him already. He survived both, but he must be very, very sensitive about this specific topic. Now, if I'm right about this, then what has happened is that Xi Jinping has in effect called Lindsey Graham's bluff. He said to Trump, there'll be all hell to pay, but he didn't say it, but he conveyed to Trump, there will be all hell to pay if this bill passes. And Trump has had to go and tell Graham, Lindsey Graham, and the other Republicans, well, for heaven's sake, we can't do this. We're going to get ourselves into all kinds of problems, not just with the Chinese and the Russians, but who knows with whom else. It'll be a body blow to the US economy and to the world economy overall. And it's not going to stop the Russians, and it's not going to shift the Chinese. We're trying to make up with the Chinese at this time. and the Russians, our Ukrainian friends, are doing all of these wild and crazy things against the Russians, and you must back off. And I expect, by the way, that with support in Congress, weakening Lindsey Graham is indeed going to back off. We probably will get a bill because, unfortunately, we've been brought to this point, but it is going to be so watered down that, as I discussed in my program yesterday, it is not going to make any difference at all, given that as things stand, the President of the United States is able to impose tariffs, even 500% tariffs, and sanctions without getting or needing congressional approval anyway. Or at least that is what Donald Trump himself says and is going to argue in court, ultimately even to the Supreme Court of the United States. So there it is. The bluff has been called. I have regularly said that if the first law of war is not to march on Moscow, that was, of course, first said not by me, but by the British Field Marshal Montgomery. But if the first law of war is don't march on Moscow, the first law of diplomacy is do not bluff Beijing. Because if you do, your bluff is bound to be called. And here we see that that is exactly what has happened. It is not Donald Trump's bluff. In this case, it is Lindsey Graham's. And if he's angry and upset and annoyed about it, he should have a better sense of the sort of people he's dealing with. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about all of this. Now, going back to Ukraine, I've said already that I thought the drone attack on the air bases was a mistake. It appears to have done limited damage, far less than some people are still claiming. And it has caused trouble for Ukraine, serious trouble for Ukraine, with some important people in the United States. Now, just to clarify, or at least not to return to one particular point, I received a rather interesting email from someone who has served in an Air Force capacity. I'm not going to say more because I absolutely cannot. Who says that it is in fact routine for aircraft and bombers to be removed around bases. The idea that bombers and aircraft are left in static conditions is wrong, and that shuttling aircraft around from one base to another is not only common and even routine, but it is not a particularly expensive thing to do, and it's even done in peacetime, and it would certainly be done, of course, in conditions of wartime also. So to repeat again, I don't know the facts here, but this is the information I'm getting. I've also, by the way, heard, inevitably, many more contradictory things about the Taurus missile. Someone, again, who knows about these things, and I'm not going to say who, tells me that the Taurus missile actually works essentially entirely in a terrain-following capacity. It is not intended to be used with GPS and GLONASS. At least that's my understanding of what this person is saying. He says that the information is indeed provided by the United States, though, again, reading between the lines of what this person is saying, and this may be wrong. This may be wrong in terms of my understanding of what this person is saying, not whether what this person says is correct. That some of this information may already have been provided to Germany by the United States. However, it is nonetheless the case that American permission to use the Taurus missiles would still be needed, and the missile itself is not particularly stealthy and is not particularly fast. And though it flies very close to the ground and is therefore difficult to track, it is obviously not the game-changing weapon that some people believe it to be. And I was also told, and this time by another source, that however capable the Taurus missile is, we're only talking about around 150 of these missiles, and that is nowhere near enough to change the overall direction of the war or anything close. Just saying. But put all that aside. Put aside the Taurus missile. Put aside the realities about the attacks on the bases. There's been a very disturbing article in the Washington Post by David Ignatius, very well connected and well informed journalist. Some people believe that he's the mouthpiece of the CIA. I don't buy that myself, but he's clearly very close to the US intelligence community, or at least some sections of it, and he is an outspoken supporter of Ukraine. And he's written a very disturbing article in which he says that Ukraine's dirty war, as he puts it, against Russia is only at its start. Ukraine's dirty war is just getting started. That is what David Ignatius tells us. And it is a really, actually, I found, altogether disturbing article. Not only are the Ukrainians going to carry out more operations, or planning to carry out more operations, like Operation Spider's Web, the attack on the drone bases, not only are they going to continue to engage in assassinations, not only are they going to continue to plant bombs in railways and show, as far as I can see, indifference to attacks on civilians, but they're now planning to launch attacks on the high seas, destroying Russian ships wherever they can, even in the Far East. Ignatius describes a very, very complicated operation that appears to have been attempted against a Russian army base on Desantnaya Bay near Vladivostok in the Far East. He doesn't say whether the operation was successful. It clearly wasn't. But anyway, he's talking about attempts to carry out similar attacks, as I said, on Russian merchant ships in the high seas, and not only Russian merchant ships, but also merchant ships trading with Russia that belong to what David Ignatius calls Russia's allies. That would imply attacks, for example, on the merchant ships of countries like China. And, well, there's an awful lot more of that apparently being talked about and discussed in Kiev, even as the military situation for Ukraine goes from bad to worse. It looks as if the Ukrainians are busy thinking more and further about doing more of these things. We are also told, at least David Ignatius tells us, that Ukraine actually had a specific plan to attack Transnistria, though they called it off at the last moment, and we're not told why. I'll read this section, actually, because it's quite astonishing. He says, the countries bordering Ukraine might become new battlegrounds as the war continues. An example is Transnistria, a breakaway region of Moldova on Ukraine's western border that is aligned with Moscow and hosts a Russian peacekeeping force. The word peacekeeping is in quotation marks, though I don't see why it should not be called a peacekeeping force, given that it's been authorized to be there by the UN Security Council and is not participating in any war. But anyway, let's jump over that point. He then goes on to say, David Ignatius then goes on to say, using Russian defectors and other local forces. Which other local forces? The Moldovan security forces? Ukraine considered an operation to attack the Russian troops there, but decided against opening this new front. I have to say that this section of David Ignatius's article, and notice this is all stated as fact. It's not suggested that this is something that there's any doubt about. Here we have an article that says that Ukraine is scheming to extend the war to other countries, Belarus, Moldova, obviously, the Baltic states, which other countries exactly? And trying to widen the war in that way, and even had a plan to attack a Russian force legally present in a third country, which is Moldova, but that this was called off at the last moment. And David Ignatius says all of this without finding this at all surprising or concerning. It doesn't worry him, it seems, in the slightest. It doesn't worry him that the Ukrainians have assassinated people in Russia. He refers to the murder of Daria Dugina in Russia, a completely innocent civilian killed when the Ukrainians tried to assassinate her father, just saying. Anyway, he talks about all of this as if this is entirely normal and even appropriate activity. And he doesn't seem to be at all bothered by the implications of all of this. Now, as I said, to be very clear, even a country with a government like the one in Kiev, only does things like this when it is losing a war and losing it badly. To my mind, what David Ignatius's article shows is how desperate and reckless and completely out of control the government in Kiev has now become. Now, I have to say, going back to Ambassador Kalin's comments to Sky News, going back to the reports I discussed in my program yesterday about the Russians now working through the procedures to give themselves the authority to attack Ukrainian officials, to go after specific Ukrainian officials, going back to Ambassador Kalin's comments about the attacks on the Dnieper bridges. I think that, Ukraine, these are the least of the things Ukraine could be facing. I mean, the idea of attacking, for example, Chinese ships who are carrying or conducting, involved in the conduct of trade with Russia, is absolutely astonishing. And I would have hoped that people in the United States who must be reading David Ignatius's piece, people in the administration, would be phoning people in the intelligence community in the United States urgently, trying to find out exactly what is going on and asking the Ukrainians, what precisely is all this about? And what exactly is it that you're intending to do? I'm going to make a suggestion here, which is that if the Ukrainians do any of the things that David Ignatius is talking about, then worrying about the Dnieper bridges and the targeting of their officials is going to be the least of their concerns. At that point, all sorts of other people, not just the Russians, are going to start coming for them as well. Anyway, this is where I'm going to finish today's program. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. Don't forget, if you've liked this program, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Last but not least, we're carrying out a major promotion on our shop, so please go to our shop and make sure that you take full advantage of that. Now, that's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.